Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. In today's episode, Sona and I will be breaking down the first episode of season 2 of Severance, an episode called Hello, Ms. Cobell. And we'll know exactly what that means when we break down the episode. Before we get into that, I have a few conversation points.
Let's hear it.
Sona, right by your apartment, Apple has been trying so hard, not just trying, but successfully, I think, capturing the social media conversation just for this week. And one of the things they did was to have a glass case inside of Grand Central Station with part of the set of Severance from here in New Jersey, actually shipped over there, and the entire cast, including Patricia Arquette. So if there's any question that Miss Cobell will indeed be coming back to the show, she's inside the cubicle. And they're doing actual lines, actual scenes from this second season of the show. Ben Stiller was there snapping pictures. And of course, thousands of people were there as well. But Sona, you missed it apparently.
It kills me that I missed this because if I had known in the moment, I would have dropped everything and run. Yeah, I've been seeing it all over social media and it really hurts.
Also, I wanted to mention that I published an episode last week where I covered the most anticipated shows of 2025. Definitely on my list. And I pointed out that I think this is definitely high on your list. Not only White Lotus, which of course is coming back in less than a month, but Your Friends and Neighbors, the new John Hamm series, also on Apple TV Plus. Apple TV Plus making a big concerted effort this year to make this project, this TV project, a real thing for them. And I had this on my near the top of my anticipation list for the year. Just to let you know, Sona, my number one, and I think you might agree with this, by the way, was Mr. and Mrs. Smith was my number one show of the year.
Mr. and Mrs. Smith was so much fun. And I feel like you're putting me on the spot a little bit. I didn't know we were going to have a conversation about our top shows. I have a hard time keeping track of time. So whenever we talk about what our favorites are that we've discussed, I always go back to Fleischman's In Trouble, but I think
yes.
that might have actually been, was that in 2024 or 2023? It might have been in 2023.
Yeah, that's 2023. You know what? I was going to say that.
Yikes,
I wanted to
flies.
shout that out. I was going to give that an opportunity to shout that out, to say exactly that. Oh, that's a show no one talked about because it kind of bridged 2 years. But now I realized that was last year because I was basically not publishing episodes at the end of last year, given just.
We had a really weird lull because of everything that was going on in the entertainment industry. So,
right.
Okay, well, I still highly recommend Fleischman's In Trouble.
I agree.
But
completely.
yes, it cannot justifiably be on a 2024 top 10 list. But yes, Mr. and Mrs. Smith was fantastic. So much fun. Really great take on that story that, from the movie, kind of jumping off of that kind of dynamic. And it was so fun to watch, and I looked forward to it.
And a year of spy shows, by the way. Part of the reason I put that at the top of the list was because so many spy shows, a lot of them were in my best of list. So I wanted to shout that one out. Also, because I feel like, I guess it did do well because they announced that it had one of the biggest premieres and it's getting a second season.
Right.
I feel like maybe just because it was so early in the year, it's kind of forgotten. And so I wanted to draw some extra attention to it.
Yeah, I totally support that.
And there were other ones I really liked. Shogun, which I don't think you've watched yet. Definitely, that could have easily been my number one. That show has won all the Emmy Awards, and now it won all the Golden Globe Awards. I wanted to shout out something that wasn't getting that kind of end-of-year attention, and which is also excellent, by the way.
That's what I hear.
One more thing. Were you an ER fan?
I was, and I see Noah Wyle is
That's why I bring it up.
playing a doctor again in a new show that's coming out.
It's out now. They have 3 episodes so far. They had 2 last week. I shouted it out very briefly. Just watched the 3rd episode last night. I'm watching this with my wife, who's a medical professional. It's not the kind of high energy, heightened version of ER. It's much more naturalistic. And my wife, basically her critique of the show was that everything that happens in the show is 100% spot on, except for the fact that no one would ever be like, no doctor would be looking at 8 patients at the same time. She's like, you have like multiple doctors managing the floor. You're not going to have one guy literally bopping around from, between 12 different cases. But of course, that's television. But she says in general, this is much more realistic. And I'm very much enjoying it so far. It's a 15-hour shift. Each episode is 1 hour. They're 3 hours
Okay.
in right now. But if you do like that ER vibe,
I
as a
do.
matter of fact, the Michael Crichton estate has sued the pit for
That's
copyright infringement,
interesting.
which I think is total baloney, by the way, as if there hasn't been 5,000 medical dramas
Yeah.
before ER. I'm sorry.
Doctors, lawyers, police officers, they
Exactly.
will always be making dramas about them.
Exactly. Could you imagine someone like suing whatever a procedural for being like, there were no police procedurals before Law and Order? I'm like, well, except for the entire history of television, then yes, you are correct. But to that point, that HBO is not even trying to hide this. As soon as this ends, what do they recommend to me? Hey, why don't you watch some episodes of ER, which of course are also on their streaming platform.
Funny. Well, I do find Noah Wiley very likable and very fun to watch. So,
I gotta say, I was not a huge watcher of ER, and I'll say so. I don't have that much experience with Noah Wiley. And two things I say about that: one is he looks great. He's in his 50s now. He
I
looks
saw that.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't look his age. He's held up really well. And second of all, as someone who didn't watch ER, he's someone who just is on the screen and holds your attention, which I think is, that's a star, basically, is what it comes down to.
Yeah,
And
the charisma for
yes,
sure.
exactly. So yeah, I'm enjoying it very much. And of course, in Los Angeles, the fires are just starting to be contained. But one of the outcomes of this, unfortunately, was that David Lynch, who was very sick with emphysema, had to leave his house because of the fires. He's been very sickly and apparently died, the day after they moved him out of his house to avoid the fires. So that, for me, obviously, my affinity for Lynch throughout my film going career.
Yes, I was thinking you must be taking it very hard.
But I always, was always looking forward to whatever he did next. And he was working on something. So unfortunately, we will not get to see it. But we did at least get to see, for anybody out there who has Showtime, the final season of that massive 17 episode Twin Peaks series from now 6 or 7 years ago at this point. Doesn't seem that long ago, honestly. It's such an incredibly influential director.
Yeah,
And
as you know, I am not the biggest David Lynch
yes,
fan for reasons that have to do with my own tolerance for quirky, strange things. But obviously, he was brilliant and has left a mark on movie making that will last forever.
just recently, another podcast called Blank Check went through his entire filmography. It's probably the most popular film podcast out there. And it's very interesting to have all these famous critics and actors and filmmakers talking about his career. And you realize how influential he was to multiple generations. So certain filmmakers were saying, like, I saw Eraserhead as a midnight movie in the 1970s, and that's why I became a filmmaker. And Steven Spielberg, for example, is a big fan of that film, even though he was very mainstream, but he always a fan of Spielberg. He's interviewed him. Lynch has interviewed him multiple times. And as a matter of fact, in The Fabelmans, which was Spielberg's previous film, David Lynch played John Ford in that movie. So one of his last acting performances. So it's very interesting to see how he was so influential to filmmakers of the 70s. And then his very next film he makes, The Elephant Man, which gets him the Academy Award nomination, is a huge box office success. He follows that up with a huge bomb, which is Dune. But then, of course, the Dune movie, which was seen, his version of it, not a very good film, was seen by Denis Villeneuve and was his inspiration and why he, as a young man, always wanted to make the Dune films, which, of course, now have become hugely successful in pop culture yet again. And then there's a whole generation of folks who saw Blue Velvet, and that became a starting point for their careers. Of course, a whole generation of movie makers and TV producers who grew up watching Twin Peaks and how Twin Peaks changed the type of television we saw. A direct influence on, for example, The X-Files, but like really kicked off the idea of prestige TV. And then, of course, a whole generation of folks after that. Mulholland Drive is one of those films that when you talk to filmmakers now, younger ones, they're like, I saw Mulholland Drive and it changed the way I saw cinema. And there's so many generations of people who had that experience over and over again with him. So someone who's not a mainstream director, but so influential on the culture. So, and honestly, you bring up like quirky television. would a show like Severance exist if it wasn't for Twin Peaks, for example?
What an interesting question. And I also remembered while you were talking, this is possibly an obscure reference, but I love the show Psych, which
Hmm.
was from quite a while ago now, but I think it's really a great show and brilliant in its way. And one of the things that Psych would do is kind of have an homage episode to different cultural references. And they had an episode that was entirely an homage to Twin Peaks, and it was really fantastic.
Yeah, we even saw it in another show that was on my best of list, by the way, A Man on the Inside. There's that episode where Ted Danson's character wakes up and he's speaking into his handheld microphone, and there's this
Yes,
jazz
you
music playing on the
mentioned,
and it's just like,
yes,
well, that is literally the beginning of pretty much all of season one of Twin Peaks. So yeah, he'll be very missed, but a great treasure trove of films. Oh, and like I mentioned, I went into Max yesterday to watch The Pit, and even though he just died, the Max app was updated immediately, and apparently, I mean, on there, I was not aware of this. They have Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, the film. Not an
hmm
entry point here, by the way. Maybe his most difficult film to watch, so I wouldn't recommend to start there. But they have The Elephant Man, they have Eraserhead, believe it or not. They have Dune. They have Inland Empire, and I think they have Mulholland Drive, possibly. If not Mulholland Drive, oh, and Blue Velvet, I should say. Blue Velvet's the other one they have. So most of his filmography is actually available on Max, and I know for a fact that you can watch Wild at Heart and Mulholland Drive too is available to stream pretty readily, although not on Max, but look around for it. You'll definitely find it. And by the way, I wouldn't be surprised if like on Netflix next week, they have all of his films available. They're usually really good at compiling these things when something like that happens in the news. Anyway, he will be missed. For me, an incredibly important filmmaker, but I think in the culture in general.
for sure.
Okay, let's get into this episode of. I'm just laughing at my first note here on the Severance episode. What did you think of this 4 minute previously on Severance? This like made my head hurt. What did you think of this?
Well, I was so grateful for it. As I mentioned last week, I think you had shifted from asking me if I was going to rewatch some of the season one episodes to pleading with me to rewatch some of the season one episodes. Yet I did not heed your pleas. And I did not watch any of the season one episodes again. So I was very grateful to have this recap, although to some extent, yes, it raised more questions than it answered for me because there were certain things that I had very little recollection of, but still happy to have the refresher along with the article that you very kindly sent me the other day that summed up, I think the title of the article is What You Need to Know before
Yeah.
watching season two. So for me, it was very helpful. And I could have watched another 4 minutes, honestly.
Yes. Well, I mean, that was I watched this with my wife. One of the very few things we ever sit down and watch together. We did also watch The Pit, so maybe hopefully we will start watching more things together. She needed those 4 minutes, although we have discussed the show multiple times, and she did rewatch when I was doing my rewatch. She did sit in and watch some of that with me. And when she had questions of like, what's going on here? I would kind of fill her in since I was in the middle of watching the full rewatch of the series. So she had a little more context than you did, but some of this was just a reminder to her. And we were just laughing at the fact that at the beginning, it starts off pretty slowly, where it's like, the first scene where Helly wakes up, and I'm like, okay, they're starting slow. Towards the end, they're just like quick cutting
Frantic, yes.
scenes that were basically all the memes that you might have seen from season one, all just packed together. And we were just laughing out loud because it's just like, these are just scenes that make no sense at all. There's absolutely no context in between them. It was very, very funny to watch. But I mean, as a refresher to me, I think it basically assumes that you have seen the show relatively recently, like maybe within a year or so. Of course, this show has been off the air for 3 years. For me, obviously, all of this was like, oh yeah, I see everything that they're reminding me of. But, you suddenly see someone get hit in the head with a bat when there's been no, sign of violence in this whole entire show up until that point. It's just like, okay, what is happening now? It's, I guess it's the best they can do because a lot of stuff happened in that season of television. Most people who watched the show obviously loved it. I had some folks that we recommended this to, some friends that we know, me and my wife. And we had dinner with them and they're like, what was that show you made us watch? And they were like, that show was so boring. Nothing happened in it. And I'm like, I don't know what show you guys were watching because there's a lot of
Did
stuff
they
happening in that
watch the
show.
whole thing or just a single episode?
They did. And they also said that, oh, the ending was good, but they didn't like the rest of it was just totally boring. And I'm like,
Okay,
wow.
first of all, I don't know why you would keep up with the
Yes,
entire
I agree.
season.
Yes.
If that's how you feel, that seems like it would be very painful. But I guess I give them credit for sticking it out.
They stuck it out. Exactly.
But I do think it is not a typical show. It is quirky. There are times, if I recall, that we discussed the show that I said, I don't know about this. I'm not sure I would have finished this season if we weren't discussing it,
Mhm.
but I did grow to really appreciate what it's trying to do, which is a very weird thing, I think, what it's trying to do. It's
Yeah.
working on a lot of different levels, some
Right.
of them very relatable and superficial. Some of them, I guess all of it is relatable, but some of it much, much deeper, right? So
Sure.
you
Yeah.
kind of have the office politics aspect of it, which I really enjoy. And then the idea of the pain of an insurmountable loss and the things you do to cope with that. I mean, there's a lot
Right.
happening.
The episode I published last week by myself is over an hour long. So, and it was me just talking about the all these different aspects of the series. So, first of all, and you may appreciate this, it was maybe the first 15 minutes or so, which my wife also listened to, just talking about exactly what you mentioned, how even now, 3 years later, there is maybe even more resonance in this idea of how we fetishize and literally build cults around, not only businesses, which have more and more power and are less and less scrutinized in our culture, but even though the people who created those businesses, right? We think about how Elon Musk basically is running the country now, right? So it's like more and more so we have this culture, and there's obviously satire about that in the show. So I have really just kind of like the cultural references and the resonance that the show has, even more so, I think, now in the current context. And then I go and have, I break down analysis of all the characters' names. I get into other speculation that I think even as first episodes, some of the things I speculated on are becoming apparently true here in the show. And we can talk about them when we break down the episode specifically. But to your point, I think that there are these layers, right? There is the tragedy of the characters. There is the fact that people lose themselves in work and what that means, and how we do code switch and define ourselves by the work we do and the limits of that, and how we sometimes work, especially in large corporations. And you may, at a fundamental level, disagree with what the corporation does, although your job is really to be there and hang out with your friends and make sure they're successful and they have their own personal responsibilities, that why they need that job. And I think in the end, you're just a cog in the machine. And I think that is the culture we live in now, because everything is so disconnected, the end result of your labor and the work you do day to day. Probably less so in your line of work, but very much as I work in technology, how I think about
Yeah.
how this is so relevant to the world we live in now. And also, of course, since I've been consulting for decades now, I've worked in many of these large companies. For me, it's very funny because every time you go work at a new company, even for a short period of time, you have these videos you have to watch, and there is this cult of personality, whether it's earned or not, because it's an expectation. So all of this satire really resonates for me, but I think that there's more to it there as well. When you start asking the question of, well, what is this company really doing? And I think that this is touching on all those anxieties, for to say the least. And then they throw in on top of it the this broader conspiracy.
So it's all of these ideas and feelings that are very relatable, but in this austere environment for the most part, right? So the dichotomy of that is very strange also. All of this to say, I can understand why it wouldn't work for somebody.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's basically the fundamental joke. You think about how antiseptic and dull the culture, if you're inside, how they literally say there is a culture in our company. And you think, if this was a culture, truly, if this was like your identity, how boring or how antiseptic or how dull would the culture here be? And this takes that joke to the extreme, right? Saying like, these people literally have no external culture. This is the only culture they have. But to your point, that joke for me is very funny. If that doesn't work for you as a concept, then this show's not going to work for you, basically.
Yeah, I wonder too if the people that you're thinking of, whether they work in an office culture or
They
not. I mean, we
don't.
don't you
Yes, they
see,
don't. They're
I think that
doctors.
is a
They're doctors.
big
Yes.
part of it.
Yes,
If you
I
don't
agree.
have that point of relation, I think it probably seems 10 times stranger than it does for those of us that have that
Right.
point of relation.
Yeah, I completely agree that that is probably the hurdle there. They're both doctors, and
Yeah.
they do not have this experience at all, right? So
Yeah, I remember very different type of movie, but I remember having this discussion with somebody about the movie Office Space,
yes.
which is one of my all-time favorites. But the person said, until I worked in an office, I didn't understand that movie at all or why anyone would like it. But now that I have, it all makes sense. I think that point of relation is pretty important to appreciating it.
It's also like the show The Office, right? Which has the same kind of a
Same,
feeling to it,
yes,
where
for
if you
sure.
don't have that experience, then you're going to be like, this is the most tedious.
Yeah, the
Uh,
minutia of it all. Yeah.
that's all of it
Hmm.
is minutia, right? So,
Yeah.
all right. So this first episode, directed by Ben Stiller, and he won't direct all of them, but just like season one, direct most of the episodes. And written by, still the only writing credit goes to Dan Erickson, who wrote the original. I think it was a movie script that Ben Stiller saw some 10 years ago, maybe more, and expanded into a TV series. And he still is listed as the only writer. I mean, sometimes even when you have a writer's room, it shows just the main writer. But
Hmm.
if he is indeed writing all these scripts, this is very impressive that he's been the solo writer for this two seasons of the show.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Of course, we pick up, to us anyway, immediately after the thrilling events of the final moments of season one. We hear all those different voices. We see Mark Scout, or Mark S. as Innie, waking up inside of the elevator. He steps out. This very cool shot. Must have cost a fortune, just the logistics, the number of setups. This is presented as one continuous shot, but of
Yes.
course, the camera's moving constantly. It's floating above him, it's behind him, it's turning around corners.
Amazing.
So these are many, many setups in probably one or two sets that are made to look like a sprawling office complex. It goes on for 5 minutes.
The
I don't know if you've
music is
seen those.
great too. The music is so good here.
Yes, which I think is this jazzy score was kind of, they used this in one other episode, which I can't remember. It may even be the exact same score. So this is an interesting way to kick things off. I was very curious of the amount of time that they spend on this. I think it's about 5 minutes of him running around, which made me ask a couple of questions. One is, why is he so disoriented, considering that theoretically this has been in his mind just moments? But also, I did make me wonder of all the maps we saw in season one that different people try to map of the severed floor. If
Hmm.
somebody, I'm sure on Reddit, has already, correlated all the bends and the of this run through the floor to that map, I'm sure.
Well, what I thought of when I was watching it is, as you may or may not know about me, I have the worst sense of direction on the planet. I cannot find my way out of a paper bag. And I thought this office would be an absolute nightmare for me. I'd be walking around in
It all looks
circles
the same,
all
right?
the time. Yeah. So I was kind of obsessed with the sameness of it all and the fact that I would never be able to figure out where I was going. But yeah, most people have a better sense of direction than me. So your question is fair.
And we do see some of the moments or some of the locations from the first season. Like there's that one where he's in the conference room where, of course, they found Rickon's book, or he's right outside of it. And then, of course, there's his work area. But first, the first place he goes to, of course, is wellness, because he wants to go talk to Miss Casey. When I published my thoughts on the first 8 minutes, which previewed, I think, on Christmas Eve, they dropped those first 8 minutes of the show. So I had seen this area, this part of the episode already. And someone on YouTube called me out for having misidentified that the room he walks into with wellness was the room that everybody goes into to meet with Miss Casey. And it had been stripped, which, of course, we had seen at the
Yeah.
end of episode 2 that they had already begun to strip that room down. But what's interesting here is, and they were correct, this is actually the waiting room to go into wellness, which is where Bert and Irv met for the
Hmm.
first time. And what's so strange about this room, it's not like the two doors, the in and outdoor, are boarded over. I wonder if this is the same location, basically, what it comes down to, because they're not just like they put a piece of sheetrock over there. It's as if the walls were never marked with the doors at all.
Not surprising to me, right? I feel like being left with the cliffhangers that we were and what we know of Lumen, I wouldn't be surprised if, they've got some kind of setup where within 12 hours they can completely,
Sealed it all up.
yeah, rejigger the entire Severance floor so that nobody can ever locate anything again.
It's just a weird detail to have the walls seem to be completely virgin, as if they had never been marked, and to leave it that way. But then we do see signifiers, right? We see the painting that Irv and Bert bonded over. There is a marking on the wall, like where the painting was. And of course, the words wellness are scraped off the wall, but were obviously there. So it's interesting that, I'm not sure what that's trying to tell us. I guess we'll know more once we know what's happening on the outside of this world, which I do think we're going to probably find out pretty quickly, probably next episode. And this is creepy when he's standing there. There is somebody in the background watching him. They're out of focus, but it's definitely not Milchik. So I'm not sure who that was. It's somebody we probably haven't met yet. He does eventually make it to his work location, to his cubicles, and he meets a new team there. We have Mark W., two Marks. Mm-hmm. This is a problem, of course, played by Bob Balaban, who I've not seen in anything in quite some time.
He's one of those guys that always shows up.
Oh my God, he's been in so many things. I don't know if you know this, Sona, but he actually wrote, I think, only one produced screenplay, which was Gosford Park, which got him an Academy Award nomination. That film was nominated for Best Film. I think the same year as Mulholland Drive, actually. That's how long ago. That's like 25 years ago. Just to tie in David Lynch into this conversation again. He's had not only this long career as a character actor, but he's directed a bunch of things, like just TV mostly, and written this Academy Award nominated film. I'm like, this guy's been all over the place, but I have not seen him in probably a decade in anything.
Well, what I liked about this plot point, speaking of the whole office culture aspect, that is something that happens not just in offices, but in classrooms as well, right? When you've got two people with the same name and then
Yes.
You need to use the initial or some other way to distinguish them. And, as someone who's currently on a team with 4 Michaels and counting, I get it. And it's funny because, I think back on my first day at one of my jobs where often in firm memos, we would refer to people by their initials because it was a very small place. And when I met one of the partners, his literal first words to me were, "We already have someone with your initials. Do you have a middle name?" He was so concerned about how we were going to distinguish ourselves going forward.
This is the same type of person, right? That's his primary concern. I mean, of course, it's his name as well. We also see Alia Shawkat here as Gwendolyn.
Another character. Did not recognize her. Great point.
Oh,
yeah.
You did? Yeah. So she's been in a lot of things recently, actually. We have this Italian actor. I do not know this actor playing a character, Dario R.
Hysterical. Love
Very
him.
funny.
I love when he starts. This whole episode was very funny. I don't remember because I didn't rewatch despite your pleas. If last season was generally as funny as this specific episode, but I thought this episode was really, really funny.
I think I mentioned this to you, that part of the pleasure of watching this as a binge and not getting caught up, since I knew the plot, on what the mystery might be, just appreciating some of the weirdness as being like, oh, that's a clue. And maybe it was sometimes, but a lot of it was just like funny, quirky character details, which I loved, instead of trying to overread things on the second time around. Mm-hmm. So I do think anybody who does decide to rewatch season 1, you will find it to be even funnier than the first time around. Oh, and of course, the new deputy floor manager replacing Mr. Milchik, who we're going to see in just a moment, is Miss Wang, who is a child, 12 years old, maybe 13.
So here's my question about this, which again touches into this office culture idea. And I don't know if it's purposeful or not, but what this made me think of is that, and I don't know if this is a universal experience, but I know for me and my husband being solidly in middle age and having people in their 20s enter the workforce with us, we'll sometimes be joking about, you're a child. What do you know? Oh,
Right.
it kind of made me wonder if they were like taking that idea and running with it
Right.
by putting a literal child into the office. And that
Right.
feeling when you're middle-aged of being like, oh my God, these people are just so young.
I did make me ask a whole bunch of questions. Okay, are they making some joke about, well, maybe there's some places around the world where their child labor laws aren't as strict, but theoretically they are in the United States regardless. The body here's here, right? She exits, and if she exits to the outside world, to a body that is, in high school or something. And what is she doing when she's supposed to be in high school or middle school, for all we know her age? But yeah, many questions about this character for sure, whether it's legal at all to have her working there. But I do agree with that. Like, I worked at a company where I was in charge of the college hires, and a lot of them were on my actual team. When you get to a certain age, and I think you could probably agree with this, Sona, it's all kind of a blur. Like, they could be 30
Oh,
or
I've never been able to
22.
know how old anyone is. Fair. Yes,
In my head, they're generically young. That's it.
exactly. Much
It's more when you
younger
talk
than
to them.
me.
It's more when you talk to them and you think like, oh my God, they have like none of the cultural context that I have.
I literally had an experience with someone who was a recent college graduate and quite brilliant, but he did not know how the mail worked. So it's those types of interactions that make me feel like, yes, you're a child.
Yeah, speaking of culture, right?
You've
Like the
never
whole
needed
idea,
to know how the mail works.
right? And I never use the mail anymore, by the way. But like you
Right,
said, there was a
exactly. I mean,
time when it
it's
was
not,
essential,
yeah, it's not relevant to your life the way it
right?
was for me. Yeah.
So Milk shows up with these blue balloons, all with Mark's face on them, all facing the same way. By the way, I mean, how painstaking was it to get these balloons to all face the same way? Just thinking about this from a production standpoint.
Yeah, I didn't realize the face was on them until towards the end. So
Hmm.
I did think the visual of this is amazing. And I
Hmm.
think
Yes.
it was in some of the previews, right? The image of him walking through the
Hmm.
hallway holding the balloons. But gosh, I loved it. Aesthetically, I thought it was really pleasing.
Yeah, the design work in this show in general is so beautiful. On the rewatch, I really thought about it again. There's this incredible sequence where maybe it's in episode 2 or 3 where we've never seen this at that point, where Mark is still sitting at his desk, and I think it's Irv or Dylan is leaving for the day and says, "Do you want me to get the lights?" And he says, "Sure." And he turns off the lights, and you see just Mark as the only remaining person here in the middle of this large space, and the lights are turning off in sequence, and it's just the beauty, but beautiful of that, like this brightly lit, green carpeted, brightly colored room, and as it like basically goes to black, and it's really striking visual. All the use of this very limited set, which could be very boring. You think about a show like The Office, which is very entertaining for many reasons, but is pretty visually uninteresting. For them to take a similar type of office space and make it really visually compelling, considering how
Hmm.
repetitive it all can be, which makes sense too thematically when you think about the fact that this is the people's entire worlds, right? So it has to have its own bigness to it, right? For us, it would seem like stifling, but to them, it is their whole universe. So Milchik gives him the rundown. He's gotten the promotion. Cobell is out. It's been 5 months, supposedly. Question mark there, since there's no way for him to know.
Right.
The newspaper he gives him saying, "Hey,
Oh, that's so funny.
so
Yes.
funny."
Look at this amazing cover story. It's all blacked out.
Yeah. It's not only the redaction. Go back if you haven't done this already, anybody out there as well, and look at the picture itself. They're in
I
a
didn't get a
car.
chance. Yeah, tell me.
They're in a car, like an open roofed car, like, the Pope or like a president would be in. But it's like the four of them are shoulder to shoulder, waving as if it's like their team photo. And they're just they get popped out of the car. Like, it looks completely unnatural. It's hilarious. It literally is like someone amateurishly cut them out and pasted them
Hmm.
onto another picture. It's very funny. So some of it is very well done, like when you consider like the photo grain that they accomplish, but the fact that they look completely unnatural and out of proportion to the car is very funny. So of course this is not true, as if we needed any additional evidence. Milchik does not let him peruse the article too long, by the way. He
Hmm.
doesn't think it's going to hold up under scrutiny for sure. And there's some interesting moments here with Milchik. Milchik gets very serious when he talks about how he had to put these doors in to keep them locked into MDR. And he said, I had to lock you inside of a box. And as an unsevered man, I have to live with that for the rest of my life. And he seems very serious about this. So, I mean, I think he obviously has some nefarious plotting going on here, and we'll get into it because there's other things that happen later in this particular episode. At the same time, there seems to be some emotional duress he's under here in multiple scenes. What do you think about Milchik's headspace right here? I mean, he's happy to get the promotion, I assume.
Yeah, I was honestly too busy thinking about Mark's other team members and what had happened to them to really focus on Milchik this episode. But clearly well, not clearly, but in my opinion, he's beginning to experience some sort of conflict about this whole situation.
Yeah, I see it in a few places. One is in this moment where he talks about locking him up, because I think about, this is based on my rewatch, if he is truly naive and really believes in the good work that Lumen is doing, he's starting to see in multiple ways, this is not only starting to wear on his team, and maybe he really does love his team, but also he's now caught up in not only Cobell's plotting, but Kier's cover up. And I think the biggest insult to him, of course, is the title of this episode. They have not even, after 5 months or more, we don't even know how much time has passed, they have still not even changed his welcome screen. So how valuable is he really to this company that maybe he's committed to? I never thought in my rewatch he would ever potentially, and this remains to be seen, if he may be, in a way, become an ally to them in this plot in the future.
In season 1, he's very much a company man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I had so many theories in that episode. Here's a theory that I was saving to have this conversation with you, Sona. I have a theory that Miss Cobell and Miss Selvig, of course, using 2 different names, but not severed in the show, the only character to have 2 different names. But then I wonder, is she someone who's not severed, but was she perhaps severed at some point, or had a relationship with her mother, for example, her mother who passed away, that we know that she has some connection to, but we don't know the details of that yet, who may have been severed at some point. Maybe she is, this is my theory, she is an outie who wants to reintegrate. She's fixated in season 1 on the reintegration process and that proving that Petey has been reintegrated. Maybe she has an innie that she has lost during this process. And as a counterpoint to that, in rewatching season 1, I think Milchik is an all-time innie. I think that he may have had an outie at some point, but now he's 100% innie. You know, he definitely is not severed. We know that for a fact. And the reason I mentioned that is there are some really naive things he does. Like, he gets really upset when people break the rules of the inside. One of the funniest moments to me that didn't seem like a clue until I watched the show the second time is when he wakes up Dylan's innie inside of his closet, and his son comes and grabs him, embraces him. He's so offended. He goes, I had a deal with your son. He was supposed to count to 10,000. He broke our deal, which was just hilarious in the moment. But then I thought to myself, of course, this is a naive person who doesn't really know how kids work. Kids are not going to count to 10,000 and comply 100% with their whatever they said to you. So that naive perspective he shows in multiple cases made me think like he very much acts like an innie. So is he all innie and is Cobell all outie? And along the lines of this particular moment, if he is someone who naively, for example, knows that he is a 100% innie and loves what Lumen has done for him, is he starting to bristle against
Yeah,
exactly.
I think this is a really interesting theory, and I know that you are very good at figuring out things ahead of time. So I would put a lot of credence into that could be what's really happening here.
I think Milchik is going to be much more central to this season of TV, and we'll see a lot more of him for sure. A lot of things on the trailer seem to be intentionally setting expectations, which they immediately deflated in this first episode. For example, it seems like he spends a lot of time with that alternate team before the team gets back together. It turns out they're back together by the end of episode 1. There's also these weird flourishes. Like, is Irv going to have some kind of psychotic episode in the show? And then that's when he sees himself as this animated character. Nope. It turns out we see what that context for that is in this very first episode. So much of what's weird in the trailer is explicitly undermined in a way here in this episode. It looks like, based on the trailer, that Cobell is really getting railroaded for being the bad guy here in this circumstance. But I do wonder, basically, if she's still doing Lumen's bidding. I guess it's way too early to make that assessment. We haven't even caught up with her yet. But do you have a feel for that? Is the story that Milchik's saying that Cobell's the one responsible for all this? She was a sadist. She was playing with you guys, and it was all bad management, and she's no longer with the company, and that's the problem? Or do you think that's just another layer of manipulation?
I do think it's too early to say. I think that is a big question. I think there's going to be a lot of questions from what I took away from this episode about people's real motivations versus what we see, right? Because there's another character that I have that question about, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Yes.
And maybe one of the themes for this season is going to be whether people, if their intentions really are what they seem to be. To go back to that original point that you made about Milchik, I hadn't thought about, and it's just funny to me sitting here now, I hadn't thought about the idea that purportedly 5 months have passed.
Right.
Can you imagine 5 months going to your desk and saying good morning, Ms. Cobell, every day for 5 months? I probably would be pretty kind of angry after the first month as well.
Absolutely. Can you imagine 5 months of that? And
right?
by the way,
at the time I was watching it, I was like, yeah, it's kind of insulting. But yes, after 5 months, it would be really insulting.
And by the way, there is what we're going to get to it when we step through the plot a little bit more, but he puts him into the elevator after this initial few days that he works with this new team. And then he comes back and the place seems to have been significantly changed again. So we may be looking at like another 3 or 4 month jump to get the team back together. So think about that. It's 5 months plus 4 months. And he's still staring at, hello, Miss Cobell.
I have a question, though, about this, and it might be something I missed, and it was explained. But doesn't Milchik tell Mark, no, the rest of your team decided not to come back?
Yes, that's exactly what he says.
So why minutes later is the rest of his team back?
Well, I mean, that's the question. I think we're going to see that in upcoming episodes. As a matter of fact, I'm certain we're going to see that. And by the way, this is a spoiler, but it's right in the trailer. There is a scene in the very trailer for season 2 where Milchik is sitting down with the Audi Mark Scout, and he's talking to the Audi, and he's saying, we need you to come back. So the story that you were desperate to come back and none of these other people were desperate to come back, you're the only one, it seems to be a lie, because it seems like he needs to be coaxed back. And as a matter of fact, maybe that is what actually happened. And once again, I'm pretty sure they're going to outline this in detail, probably in the very next episode, if not the next couple, what happened to the Audis. What I think is that they lured Mark back. They probably tried to lure them all back. They lured Mark back. And then they used Mark being back to lure the others back.
But like within hours, or he's just misrepresenting when he says no one else wanted to come back, and then just later that day, they're all back. Am I
I don't think it's later that
something?
day. Remember, the painting is there in the hallway. So I think this is probably another multiple month jump is what I think we're seeing.
Okay, I didn't understand that. Thank you for
when he
spelling it
steps
out
off
for
the
me.
elevator, that painting we see where Tyr forgives his the four of them, that painting was not there the first time Mark steps off the elevator. So I think another amount of time has passed. This is where I was saying that Milchik must be extra annoyed, because who knows, this might be months later on top of the 5.
I see.
And he still sees hello, Ms. Cobell.
Okay, somehow I had missed that time jump. So thank you for spelling it out for me.
I mean, I think we will get this context later, that there will probably be exactly that. There'll be the first luring of them back, them rejecting it, maybe them meeting on the outside world, conspiring potentially, Mark going back in, and then that being the trigger to draw the other ones in. But I think long and short of it is, I think way more than 5 months have passed by the time we get to the end of this episode.
Okay.
That's my theory. But I'm pretty certain we are going to see a lot more context for this. I don't think we need to think about it too much. I
Yeah,
think they're going to
yeah, no,
tell
that's
us.
fine. It was the timeline that I was struggling with.
I do very much like when Milchik kicks him out of the office when he says that he needs to hear it from the team itself. And Milchik says that's going to be impossible, which of course turns out to not be impossible. Maybe just took some time. But I do like the malicious way he says, enjoy your balloons.
And then
The
they just
threatening
float
balloon.
away into the ceiling a
He
minute
just
later.
abandons them. Yeah, exactly. In the middle of the office, which by the way, made me think about that. I've definitely seen that as well. A birthday party or whatever. And you go into the cafeteria or the conference room and there's like the birthday balloons just trapped up against the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
But some interesting observations with this team building exercise and just the way that the other innies talk about their offices. Of course, Gwen is very interested in knowing, well, what's the outside world like? And it made me think about things that I didn't think about at all. Like, for example, could you imagine living in an office? Like, literally, your entire context is a ceiling a few feet above your head, and suddenly being out in the wild, in the cold. I was like, wow, I hadn't thought about that. But what a huge culture shock would that be to walk outside for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, the questions she's asking about how they're so curious about the sky and does the wind feel like somebody breathing on you? It
Right.
really put it into perspective.
Exactly. And things I hadn't really thought about. In my theory episode, I also talked about the color coding. There are certain colors in the show. There's like four of them, and how they might map to the four humors or the four personality elements they mentioned in the show. From my Reddit observations when I was looking at my own, putting together my own theories, ideas, people are saying like, oh, the reason the carpeting is green is because they actually are cattle, the way that Helly had said in the first episode. And that's the metaphor there, whatever. And I'm like, I don't know if that really holds up. But I did like to hear that they had a completely different color palette in their previous office. Also interesting to know that they have these different offices all over the place. I did wonder if MDR is only happening in this particular location, but apparently it's happening all over the world.
Right.
I like that the other Mark calls Milchik Mr. Milkshake.
Yes.
And by the way, Milchik means milk. So, not a far off the mark with his misunderstanding of the name.
Hmm.
Oh, I really liked during the ball team building exercise, the passing of the ball, a really good performance by Adam Scott that he is, when they ask him to say something about himself, you see what's going through his mind.
Mm-hmm.
We actually see it on the screen that we see Casey's face or the photograph, his memory of it. But you see playing out there, like, am I going to say it? Like, how am I going to play this? And you see him going back into the mode we saw in season 1, where he's just like doing the friendly, polite thing, but it cracks a little bit, right? When Miss Wang pushes back on her being, oh, I'm a manager, so I can't be a friend, which I don't know if I really agree with that.
I love the office culture reference to sharing a fun fact about yourself.
Yes.
I dread sharing a fun fact about myself. I need
I
to
know.
just create a stock 3 or 4 fun facts that I can rotate. I like this Ms. Wong character. I think
Yes.
she's one of those people that clearly you're kind of just flummoxed by her and you don't
Right.
know what to do in reaction, partly because she's a child in this particular case.
Right.
So I liked that. And yes, as you mentioned, you could see the thoughts just kind of fleeting across Mark's face as to what he's thinking about saying, and then what he eventually lands on. And then his correction that kind of feels like it's through gritted teeth of 3 friends then.
Right. Right. Yeah, I loved all of that. And the tension there between the two of them immediately. The fact that he has this real dislike of this child really is very funny.
Yes.
And then I love this sequence, by the way. This is maybe some of the comedy you were talking about. The whole situation where they're saying, what's your perpetuity wing like? And he says, I heard the Egan's don't move around. And that was funny because, we commented on the fact that this is maybe an older office, and I've worked at places like this. IBM, for example, they have modern, nice flat screen monitors up,
State of the art. Yeah.
on the main floor. But then you're like, oh, we have to go talk to the DBA who's managing the mainframe downstairs. And they have an old school terminal. It's like, this has not been updated since 1989. And like, because that monitor is still operational, they have never changed it. As a matter of fact, they can't change it because a new monitor would not work with the old adapter. And so it's like, oh, proof here. We worked in a more contemporary location where they had animatronics, which is funny. I think of like Chuck E. Cheese or something with their animatronic
Or
Egan.
Disney, yeah.
Or Disney, exactly. Like It's a Small World. But the best part here is
Oh,
that
I hope
Dario
it's the
R.
Italian character because I loved that.
I love the idea that they just like opened this Italian branch, like, like with hardly any supplies. And they're like, we'll just make them out of brooms and we'll tape some plates on them.
Hysterical.
The CPR dummies were also brooms with plates on them.
This actor is great too. The
Yeah.
deadpan way that he's saying all of it.
I haven't seen him in anything at all. But yeah, he's very fun so far. Oh, one more thing that's interesting. It's the end of the day, maybe day 1 or day 2, that Mark is back. And it's just him and the other Mark are left. And Mark says that his previous team were a bunch of dirtbags, I think he called them. And he said because they never cleansed any of their files, never got to 100%, which then made me think about something that maybe is a much bigger theory, but I'll put a pin in it now that we can explore over the course of the season. It did make me wonder if this whole Lumen experiment of these files and cleansing these files and what they're actually doing there. And I actually have another theory. I'll get to it at the end of the episode because I think it's made explicit here that whatever's happening with those files, other teams, and these are probably hundreds of them all over the world, are not successful at this. And maybe what we saw them do last season is a rarity. And that maybe the whole plan here is, like you mentioned before, like, why are they all back now? Maybe all of this was to get them back together because for whatever reason, Lumen has this procedure, this cleansing of these files are essential to something that they're doing, or at least theorizing. These are the only team that actually has successfully done it. Maybe a little clue that it's not just the fact that they're doing this and they're one of like 1,000 groups doing this. They're the only ones that can do this, right?
Interesting.
So that remains to be seen. And then, of course, I think it's the third day, probably the only 3 days that he's back. He writes a note. And at first I was like, is he just going to finally test whether this code scanning mechanism actually works or whether that's just the way to control them? Apparently it does actually work if we needed any additional proof, because I know there are people who theorize that it's just not actually technology that exists. It's just made up. He slips it into Mark W's pocket. He shows up the next day, of course, instantly to him. Everybody knows that he tried to frame them. Gwendolyn's very upset. Were you going to frame all of us?
How he fit all of that onto that little scrap.
He did fit a lot of words on there.
Right?
Mark W, of course, thinks that he's just plotting because he wants to have the name all to himself. Given everything that's written on that note, the thing that Milchik is most upset about is whether he actually did mean, not about the bombing or anything like that, did he actually really mean it, that he's a shambolic rube?
I don't even know what shambolic means. Did you look it up? Do you know?
I've looked up shambolic before.
Chaotic, disorganized, or mismanaged.
Yeah, like when I think shambolic, I think like shambling, like somebody who's like almost like drunk, like just kind of shambled. Right, exactly.
I wouldn't use that word for Milchik.
It's not that's for sure. He is not shambolic. He seems very put together, actually.
Yeah, turtleneck and all.
Or a rube. Does not seem to be a rube either.
Yeah.
But that's the greatest offense he takes in that note.
His feelings got hurt.
Yes, of course. Yes. And then Mark tries to distract them all by saying, you haven't even seen what I did to the kitchenette, which of course was very upsetting to them. He runs to Milchik's office, plugs in that speaker and speaks to the board. Or does he? Question mark. I think he does, actually, because something happens here at this moment. And I think at this point, it's pretty clear that Milchik did not want him coming back for whatever reasons and is happy to put him on the elevator. And when he says goodbye, Mark S., it really seems like he's saying goodbye for good, but that's not what happens. As you mentioned earlier, he comes back. The office has changed significantly. There's this very strange painting. At first I thought, are their heads cut off? But no, they're like from the shoulder up. He's forgiving them, although it looks like this. I honestly feel like there's a version of this painting where their heads are decapitated because the sword even has blood on it, right? But he's like not chopping their heads off and swinging the swords at them. He is like putting his hand out above them, like forgiving them. And that's actually what Dylan walks over and reads the plaque, and it says, Kier forgiving his betrayers or something like that. So the very disturbing picture, obviously. And of course, the entire team returns. Dylan and Irv come back very quickly. It seems explicitly that Dylan and Irv are coming immediately from last season, right? There just seems to be absolutely no daylight between what happened and them arriving here. We even hear Bert pounding on the elevator doors, of course, pounding on the door, shouting for Bert in his final moments of season 1. And you could only imagine, by the way, how Irv is so despondent here. Think about the moment he's in. He has literally pounding the door at Bert's house, and now back inside the office again. So when you put yourself in their shoes, it must be really, really disorienting.
Yes, and I think this is part of the reason that I was disoriented as to the timeline.
Maybe this is what you were hinting at earlier. And then the last to arrive is Helly. And I'm not sure if Helly is coming directly from the end of season 1.
I think she may be a plant.
Yes, I thought the same. First, I thought she was overtly, this is her outie, and she is spying on them. But then I kind of changed my mind about that. But I do wonder if this is indeed her innie, but she has had to cut some kind of a deal. In other words, I think that Helly has been awake multiple times between then and now, as opposed to the other innies here, which I think we're seeing coming almost directly from season 1.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few different options of how this could be playing out. Of course, the most telling thing is, assuming we are talking about the time we saw her, Innie, go outside, what we saw really happening versus her story of what really happened. I mean, you're bringing up that it could be that she's been in and out multiple times. So maybe she's relaying a real story, but just not of that time. But, right, like she definitely was not wearing a Save the Gorilla sweatshirt watching TV.
Yeah, absolutely not. That's for sure.
And so even Irv points out, a night gardener?
Yeah, he's suspicious right away.
Yeah.
We've seen this in the trailer already, but funny that when Mark is filling them in on what's happened, and he says, apparently we're famous on the outside. We've outed this whole procedure. And Dylan goes, all of us equally, or are one of them more famous than the others? And then, of course, Milchik shows up to take them to the break room. Helly notices right away that the cameras are not in that office, although they still don't trust, and they should not trust that they're not being monitored. And
who needs cameras if you've got a woman on the inside? I'm just saying.
That's the other question. Absolutely. And then they go to the break room, which, of course, they're dreading going to the break room. But, apparently there's been some reforms. The break room now is a place where they have this orientation video. This, once again, very funny to me.
So funny.
When I've worked at different offices, all these ridiculous orientation videos we have to watch. Nothing as ridiculous as this one, but it's not that far off from other ones I've seen.
I have thankfully not had to ever watch an orientation video that I can recall.
Not
maybe
the kind
not
of office you've worked
high
in,
school when I worked retail. But everything about this is so funny. To me, culminating, the puppet show, first of all.
Yes.
Puppet show, Muppet show, whatever you want to call it, acting out of their rebellion is hysterical.
Yep.
And then the idea of bobbing for pineapples was just so funny to me.
Yeah.
So for me, those were the highlights.
I couldn't help but think, and maybe intentionally here, Zach Cherry, who plays Dylan, do you remember he had to watch an orientation video with Roman Roy in Succession? Do you remember that?
I know the scene you're thinking of, but I can't really put a face to it right now. I didn't realize it was him.
It was him. Yeah, that's the first time I ever saw him in anything. He's very memorable in that episode with Roman. And then probably the same year that I saw that was the year that Severance went on the air. And I was like, oh, there he is again. But now here he is watching a different orientation video. A couple of things I noted here. First of all, they call this the macro dat uprising. It's just weird that they don't call it micro data. I'm not sure why they had to abbreviate it. A strange detail.
I understand making abbreviations for things, but at that point, you've gone so far into the word.
Exactly. It really is like, I think that's a joke too. It's just like, sometimes there's always a need to abbreviate things. And sometimes the abbreviations are like, isn't that longer than the original word? I'm not sure. But another interesting point here is in the animation, they have actual audio of Irv saying, let's burn it all to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And in my theory episode, I was mentioning the fact that I wonder if Lumen is actually part of this experiment for sure. And by the way, I talked to Celia about this as well. And she thinks it's all an experiment and the data doesn't mean anything. And I disagree with her in the fact that the data is not real. But I do agree that this is all an experiment for sure, like a social experiment. And I think that the incompetent way that the managers are able to manage their employees and allow things to go so far in season one, I think that is part of the experiment. In other words, the failure of management to control these things, to suppress them, is actually part of what's being investigated. And I think there's a little proof of that here, because if they have Irv, they see the picture, the video of Helly and Mark kissing, of them plotting this rebellion, and of Irv saying, let's burn it all to the ground. So they obviously were watching them, and yet this happened, right? So I do wonder how much of this is all part of this broader experiment.
Yeah, I also like the idea, getting back to the video, that it kind of feels like this idea that we have right now in culture of rebranding, right? Of
Right,
like,
absolutely. Yep.
how can we put a positive spin on this? And I love that they had the two puppets kissing.
Yes, of course, even that. And Dylan did
And
not know
Dylan's
about this because
reaction, yes.
they were the only ones there when it happened. So Dylan's like, what? I did like the fact that Irv, by the way, was very entertained by this. So deep down inside, Irv still wants to be a team player because he's like laughing at the video and reacting to the really stupid jokes that the building is, criticizing people for running through it because it tickles.
Yes. Very cute. Yeah.
Even though that employee seemed really terrified when the building's talking to him, by the way. I'm glad that they animated that element of it, his reaction. Sona, what is your favorite new perk? Is it the salsa? Is it the leather candy?
No, it's the pineapple bobbing.
Speaking of the pineapple bobbing, I like the fact that there's a detail where they show that the Helly character has her hands tied behind her back. It's not like she's holding her hands behind the back. They've actually tied her hands behind her back. I'm like, that's a little disturbing. That could be like water torture.
I've actually never even bobbed for apples. I've missed that part of Americana or whatever. I can't even imagine the logistics of pineapple bobbing. That just seems very
I got to tell you that
difficult.
I bobbed for apples one time when I was in Boy Scouts at a Halloween party, and it is really hard to, grab an apple. Grabbing a pineapple,
Right? Like I
it
think
seems
maybe
pretty
you
impossible.
go for the leaves on the top, but then
That's
the
actually
weight.
good technique. I think you have the good technique there. I was thinking about biting into the side with all the spikes. I think that'd be very, very unpleasant. If first of all, you're not going to be able to open your mouth wide enough, and second of all, if you can somehow take a bite of it, I think it'll be very painful.
Yeah, it just logistically seems challenging. I think you'd have to get your teeth into a leaf and just snap back up as fast as you possibly could.
I also liked the mirror room illustration and how it
Yes.
looks utterly terrifying, and how Irving, the animated Irving, is very true to himself, is very disturbed by being in that room. So they whoever did the animation here really knows these characters very well. And I do predict that we will definitely see before the end of season 2 that mirror room and these characters in it.
A literal and figurative funhouse.
Right. And question to you, do you think they've actually removed these recording devices?
My current theory is that they have because Helly's going to tell them everything.
Yes, I agree that Helly's probably compromised in some way. Even if she doesn't know it, I would be very curious to know, let's say that this is actually Helly's innie and she's sincere and she hasn't been compromised where they've cut some deal with her and that this isn't her outie. Let's say that it legitimately is. They could potentially have a version of the chip where she does know her innie's activities. So then, yes, she could be a Trojan horse without even being aware of it.
For sure.
I do want to mention here that Milchik does promise them that these reforms have been done on the floor. And when he says to them, I don't want to be your jailer, he does seem to be very sincere in saying this. So once again, I do wonder if, maybe he is indeed their jailer still at this moment. Maybe that is his role, but maybe he's becoming more and more uncomfortable with it. So the four of them start talking about what they saw on the outside. You touched on this already. Helly makes up a totally fictional story. about like, yeah, running into a gardener, I think he was outside. This is part of the reason I think that this is her innie, even in the lying part. I got to tell you, I felt exactly like you did at first. I'm like, is this her outie just playing a role? She seemed very awkward. So I was trying to figure out why is she rubbing me the wrong way here? Is this not really her? But then I think about her story. I mean, if this was the outie Helly, she would have a much more rehearsed and
Smoother.
better story than this. It sounds like someone who's inventing someone who has very little context of the outside world.
Yeah, maybe. It did have that idea of like, people are lying when they give you too many details.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Like her shirt, and like I
Yeah.
remember like what was on it. Like, you could say like I have no idea what was on my shirt. Although I guess this would have been like a 1 minute ago in her head or 5 minutes ago. So maybe you would remember what you were wearing. Irv, of course, can't even talk about anything that's happening.
Mm.
Turturro's performance when he's talking to Dylan, literally sounding like a suicidal person,
Yes,
was really
absolutely.
heartbreaking. Like really,
Hmm.
and it's not only Bert; it's like somebody who's lost, obviously someone he had feelings for. He's lost his faith in the company, the way he defined himself before, and then this alternate version of himself, this affair with Bert, emotional affair, and then now he's lost that too. It's like he really
Yeah.
is. He has nothing. It
Mhm.
really is
Yeah.
tragic. Helly and Mark are also talking once they exit the room. And of course, Mark has told everybody about the photograph, about Miss Casey. It's a really interesting performance in general. She seems to be a little jealous of his
Mm.
interest in her, being like, well, she is my wife, to the Audi, whatever else. And part of this seems to be her moral opinion that she owes nothing to her outside. And this is where I feel like,
Hmm.
no, she's
Hmm.
probably is her innie, because she angrily says, we are not our outside selves and we owe them
Hmm.
nothing. And
Hmm.
I think that really feels like words that are coming from the innie.
Fair. Yeah.
She seems a little jealous because Casey was her Mark's wife on the outside, and he refers to her that way. But at the same time, she seems to kind of accept that, because it's like, yeah, well, that's another version of yourself. And she reminds him of that too, right? And he even says he apologizes, like, I guess because
Right.
he has these feelings for her, to say, like, you know what? I never had feelings for her like that. So
Yes, that
this
was an
is
interesting thing to say. I mean, I think it's true in that he didn't feel he was in love with her, but I think there was something between them.
in the rewatch. I have to tell you that there's no, I don't feel
You
anything
don't
there.
think so? You don't think there was like some kind of click?
When I rewatched the show, and even when I discussed it here on the podcast in the previous episode, I was wondering, what is Cobell's real agenda? Because she is fascinated with the idea that you can be reintegrated. She intentionally, over and over again, drives Mark to have sessions with Casey.
Hmm.
And of course, we didn't know about the whole Casey thing until very late in the watch. So
Hmm.
then on the rewatch, you see multiple times where Milchik is like, again, what are you doing? He literally says to her, what
Hmm.
are you doing?
Right. I remember that
So then, of
actually.
course, only in the rewatch do you realize, well, yes, she's doing this over and over again, which is a terrible idea. And
To
he's
see
worried
if they're going
about
to
it.
recognize each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when I watched it and Mark does not seem to have an emotional reaction to her, she then gets upset and sends Miss Casey away. And I was like, I don't understand why she had that reaction, because at one point she's leaning into the screen. She seems really hopeful. I'm like, does she care? She does actually
Hmm.
care about Mark. And I don't understand her overall agenda, but she definitely is alone multiple times and like cries for Mark. She has some emotional connection to him. It's not a performance. But at the same time, I'm thinking about the scene. She sends him again to see Miss Casey, and then she angrily sends Miss Casey back to the testing floor. And so I couldn't read that scene. It's only in seeing them included here as a previously on, and it's the way they edited those scenes so close together,
Maybe so.
that it kind of became clear in my mind. What she was seeing was that Miss Casey was reacting. She's saying, I
Yes.
never felt like that was the best time I ever had down here, was the 8 hours I spent with you. I think that Miss Cobell is angry by the fact that she seems to still have an emotional connection to Mark. But I don't think Mark has an emotional connection to her anymore,
Interesting.
which is interesting. But I have a theory on that too, and we'll get to it when we get to the end of the episode.
Okay. So then he is probably being honest when he says he didn't feel anything when he saw her.
It seemed to be that case. The interesting thing I wanted to ask you about the surveillance aspect of it is because I think this is really, once again, a metaphor for some of the different corporate philosophies. I find it interesting that in season one, you have them so tightly controlled by
Yes.
Lumen. And of course, it leads to rebellion. And now in this case, maybe they are in actually giving them all these perks and loosening the reins, but it still works. They still come together because they want to be there for each other. And I think that is interesting. It's like a band of brothers type idea. Sometimes if you don't control too tightly, the team itself will find its own motivation to coordinate internally and not necessarily in a negative way. I think once again, it is part of this experiment of, well, let's try this now.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like different parenting philosophies, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I think parenting is another metaphor here for sure. Yeah, we could spend another minute or two talking about Irv and Dylan's interactions. I thought it was very sweet that Dylan, always trying to be very macho and tough, is basically admitting the fact that Irv is maybe his best friend there. And he just admittedly says it overtly. If you left and didn't come back, I'd be sad. Irv takes it in, that little smirk on his face, John Turturro taking that in very sweetly, but still is pretty committed to walk out that door. But before he leaves, he wanted to make sure he knew about the paintings. So those are two really important pieces of information that the innies need to know. One, of course, is about Miss Casey's identity. And the other one is this, about the paintings, that hallway we saw when Miss Casey is going to the testing floor that points down. And of course, the giant mystery of how does Irv even know about that hallway? Has he been to the testing floor before? Like, what exactly is Irv's backstory? And you may not even remember all these details, but the reason that Irv can find Bert in that last episode of season one is because there is a list of all of the severed employees, and then scribbled on the sides are notes about the different characters. Some of them have addresses, but only a few of them. Bert is one of the people who has an address next to him, and it even has an X on the map with his name. So this is where I was touching on before, that it seems to be that possibly the Audi Irv and the Audi Bert actually know each other, or at least have met.
I had forgotten about that, but luckily they put it in the previously on.
They did put it on the previously on, exactly. But yeah, so this is very intriguing. Irv basically has been doing this investigation thoroughly outside for quite some time. But yeah, for me, this was I rewatched some of the scenes for this just to take notes. And I actually had a little bit of an emotional reaction in John Turturro. Specifically the thing that I found really tragic is when he says that if I'm not here anymore and Bert's not here anymore, in a way, we are together. And I was like, wow, what a literally suicidal perspective to have on things.
Yeah, and the comment about being ready for the pain to end, I thought was really heart-wrenching.
Yeah, and once again, you try to put yourself in these characters' shoes. He has lost everything, right? He lost his old frame. He lost his new frame in losing Bert. Just tangibly, moments before, was outside of his door, so potentially a reunion. And then, of course, on top of that, the rebellion itself has been thwarted. So it's like he really has, in his perspective, understandably, he really has nothing. But he does still have his friends. And I guess that's what he comes back for. All right, a couple more interesting things here, and then we'll wrap up the episode. And there's just the final button on the episode needs to be discussed. But Dylan gets brought back to Milchik's office. Milchik tells him, your wife's name is Gretchen. She wanted you to know that. And then they go into this secret door.
Yeah, and I think that's what got me wondering more about, I'm really dying to see Dylan's family. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we've only seen the one son, to your point earlier. I actually thought he might have been a single dad or divorced or something and staying with one of the sons. It's possible that the wife could have just been traveling or could have been on, traveling for work or something. But we also found out in the final episode of season one that Milchik tells him, you actually have three sons. Do you want to know their names? This is one of the ways he's trying to get into that room. And, Dylan is like, I want to remember my son's birth, which you can't give me, obviously.
Yeah.
Once again, just an incredible last episode of that season. My question to you is, do you think that this family visitation room, which once again does tie into the kinder, gentler mechanism of control. Because think about it, if you did have visitation with outsiders, that would make working at this company much more palatable, I think. So
Yeah,
do
but
you?
what version of you is visiting with
Right,
it
right.
doesn't make any sense to me logistically how this is going to work.
I don't think the company can allow the innies to talk to anybody who's on the
No.
outside, even if it is the family members. And on the
I
one
feel
hand, I'm
like
like,
especially if it's the family members.
yeah, that person can talk directly to your Audi and tell them, you could pass them
Right.
information that they obviously do not want getting passed back and forth.
Yeah, this to me didn't make any sense as a thing that could be real.
I don't believe it for a second.
Yeah.
I do also like when Dylan's reaction to this is, holy fuck. And Milchik goes, the holiest.
Yes.
I do like that Miss Wang is just playing not solitaire, but whatever, there's some version of it.
The
Maybe training
zeros,
people to be
right? Just
MDR
moving
techs
around
someday.
zeros. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then
But
she takes out that game that I didn't even know they still made these, or maybe
yeah.
they don't. That water game. Like
Oh,
I
they
had a
do. They
few of
do.
them. Yeah.
I was gonna say they definitely do. My daughter has them here. It's just stuff you either get at like a carnival as like a
Right,
cheap
right.
prize at the dollar store or something like that, or
Yeah.
like as a party giveaway. But yeah, they
Hmm.
still make them, and apparently they make them for Cure specifically. A lot of Cure paraphernalia, and of course she is still a kid, so this is how she spends her time.
I have another comment about Ms. Wang.
Yes,
Wang. I think Wang. You maybe are going to think I'm fixated on The Shining, but because last year when there was a room with the goats, I remember very vividly saying to you, "This feels like The Shining, where every time you open a door, there's going to be
something
something
weird.
horrible behind it." And there was a shot of her in her knee socks down a hall at some point that she reminded me of one of the girls from The Shining, the twins.
The twins, yeah,
And
exactly.
I don't know if it was purposeful or not, but that was what came to mind.
Oh, there probably will be references to other. I mean, these are obviously film fans, so I wouldn't be surprised at all. And speaking of a horror connection, the Italian character here is called Dario. His last initial is R, not a last initial of R, but Dario Argento is a very famous horror director who basically popularized the giallo, these slasher-like murder mysteries, very bloody, in
Oh,
with very bright reds and blues and the very bold colors. Anyway, the whole style of those Italian horror movies from the 70s. So I would not be surprised at all to see some of that. It maybe not as bloody as those films are, but wouldn't be surprised to see some of the aesthetics of Dario Argento films in the future.
interesting.
And I wouldn't be surprised at all, of course, because everybody's seen The Shining as well, if that's a reference point for some of the design work we see later on. And as we get to the very end, Milchik, of course, furious about it, still doesn't say Mr. Milchik on his screen. And the team is all back together. And interestingly, they are making great progress on these files. No one else has been able to clean up these files, or we suspect that's the case. And then you see the progress bar, and it says 68%, 66%. So very quickly, they are
Hmm.
doing their task at hand, and probably very important to Kier and to the organization as a whole. But Sona, the final moments of this episode, the way my wife read it was that he's thinking of Miss Casey while he's doing his work. But Sona, that's not what we see here. I paused it right before we came on this conversation. And what you see is Miss Casey's face. As he's cleaning the numbers, we see in black and white Miss Casey's face on the screen, and we see her vital statistics. And in the upper right-hand corner, it has an individual ID number. And in the high upper left, it says Cold Harbor, which maybe is where she's being stored. And then all these progress bars at the bottom. So my theory, Sona, back in my theory episode from last week,
Interesting.
is that the data sets they are cleaning are actually the chips inside of the severed folks' heads, so that it's not only that they can sever those personalities, maybe these chips can actually regulate their personalities or something like that. And is Mark actually working on her data file, his own wife's data file? And is that why it is important to have these people there in Cold Harbor, for example? Because this experiment requires that you work on people that you have some intimacy with.
Interesting.
So I do think that that part of my theorizing from last week is explicitly shown here in this final moment of the episode.
So then do you think each team member has a separate person that they're connected with somehow?
In my analysis episode, I actually theorized that they were working on their own chips. That, for example, maybe that's why innies have these different personas. Maybe what you're doing is you're removing those four tempers that they have, right? The woe, the dread, and how the different characters represent that, by the way. So you have malice, of course. They all become malicious by the end of the season. My example was just Irving, right? You start off with Irving. He's dread. He sees black ooze dripping out of his desk. He is always afraid of breaking the rules and being punished for it. But then he, frolics when he is falling in love with Bert. Then he is sad woeful when Bert is gone. And then he turns malicious by the end. So that's a very easy template to map everybody's progress onto. But if you think about how they are trying to capture or cleanse these different data sets that contain elements of all those things, I actually thought they were like cleansing their own personality in a way.
Right.
And that's why they're becoming so flat in their affect as the innies themselves. But in this case, it looks like he's actually cleansing her data file, which is a wrinkle I did not expect.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Now, what the overall goal for that is, I don't know. But there is, Sona, there is a Severance ebook that you can read. It's called The Lexington Letter. It's available in your Apple Books. Everybody who has an Apple device, go into your free books app and search for Lexington Letter or Severance, and you'll see a free ebook there. And this Lexington Letter is supposedly an email being sent to a journalist in Kentucky, a person who was severed, who started communicating with their innie. It's really interesting. It's only about 15 pages long. Interestingly, the editor who responds to this proposed article about this interaction, these email correspondence, his last name is Milchik, but not Seth. So maybe Milchik's brother. And he even says, I know someone very high up at Lumen. So maybe, maybe it's his brother that he's talking about. So there are these little Easter eggs in there, but it's a really compelling read if you have a chance to read
Interesting.
it. In the fact that they're able to communicate with each other by writing in symbols rather than letters, and in a language that this particular person who wrote this email said that she had a close sister. They had come up with a symbol-based communication method. Apparently, her innie had suddenly started to imagine these symbols in her mind and how they were a language. So something that was ingrained in her from somehow some of that knowledge had leaked in. And then how she had said, well, I'm going to try to write this letter to my outie and see if she receives it and if it will go through the scanner without alerting anybody, which apparently it works. And then the outie starts corresponding with the innie. What basically happens is the innie is just explaining to her what life is inside, asking her questions about the outside world, and then also asking what the purpose of the data cleansing, the macro data cleansing actually is. And apparently what happens is they complete a file, and then almost to the minute, the outie notices in the news some kind of terroristic attack. And then she starts to worry if there is a connection between the two things, tries to communicate with the innie, and then the innie stops responding. And it really becomes like a little bit of a thriller, just waiting for the next response in the emails. It's worth reading. And like I said, very short. But all of that is to say that there may be something very nefarious going on with what's going on within the organization and what is represented by these data files that they're cleansing themselves. Because if they are people, then they might be able to manipulate those people in some way.
Right.
Because there's a person who commits this terrorist attack. And then the question becomes, in my mind anyway, as I'm reading it, if I assume that file is a person that's being cleansed, was this someone who was like formerly severed, for example, that has this implant in their head, and now they are somehow able to control them in some way using this MDR cleansing. But read it. It doesn't overtly spoil anything, but it does raise some interesting questions about what the actual intention of this process is. They also have the MDR cleansing book, the book that tells them how to cleanse the data. The entire manual that we only see teased here, like they flip through the pages, the whole thing is there to read. So it's very funny. If you are a fan of the show, and supposedly has clues in it because the author of the email says, read this manual. It explains everything. It doesn't actually explain everything, or maybe it does. And there's some clues there in plain sight that I'm not able to
Yeah.
figure out. If you have an Apple device, and you almost certainly do, if you're watching this show, then check it out. You can search for it in Apple Books. It's free. So just search for Severance or Lexington Letter. Any speculation? What do you expect to see in the next episode?
Well, I'm hoping that we're going to return to the outside world
Yes.
to see what's going on there. And I mean, I expect that we will just based on how season one was, but also given the macro debt uprising
Right.
that we've been told about, I'm very interested to see if what's being described is close to what actually happened, how different it might be, how the tangential, or maybe not tangential, but the outside world characters that we've met
Right.
are responding to things. Like that's where a lot of my curiosity is right now. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm almost certain that they're going to be in the outside world, and had this conversation with my wife immediately after watching the episode last night. I think that we have to spend a lot of time with the outies because the whole organizing principle of season one of the show, discovering like, oh, look at these funny activities they do inside, and look at this new activity, look at that new activity, and what is macro data refining, and basically Helly being our POV character to introduce us to this world. If we're going to watch them do macro data cleansing now, it has no intrigue to it at all, right? We've seen all that. So I think that they need to do something different. And I think that's going to be the outsiders, of course, and what's happened in the interim. And B, I think we're going to also spend time with these new cast members. It almost feels like if they had cast nobodies here in as the new team members, that we wouldn't see them again. But I'm pretty sure we're going to see those actors again, and maybe the discovery of these innies talking, like how was it at your location? There may be more clues to be defined there, and then maybe seeing contention between these two groups, and that dynamic should be interesting. But I think mostly what we're going to be seeing, maybe even in the totality of this 10 episodes, by the way, 10 episodes this year, not 9 like last time, a lot of it is going to be about what's happening in the outside world. How'd you like it overall? How'd you feel being back in this world again?
It was good. As I mentioned, I was surprised by how funny this episode is. I'm interested in whether they're going to carry that through. I would imagine some episodes will be more intense and serious, and some will be a little bit more lighthearted. But I think in the first season, I was still growing accustomed to this whole device, the conceit of this show being, the severed world and the aesthetics of it with the, minimalism and being so austere, and all of that was very, maybe purposefully distracting to me. But now that I feel like I have accepted that and
Yes.
and understand that, it allows me to focus a little bit more on the actual story of what's happening and the
Right.
substance of it. And I like that. I like that I'm not as distracted by that and have just kind of accepted it as like, this is the universe this show takes place in. That's the deal.
Yeah, exactly. You have to buy in. But yeah, that's great to hear, because I know you had some qualms about season one. So
Yeah, I'm still wondering when we go back to seeing the outside world. Remember, it felt like the outside world was like 1985. I still have questions about that, but we'll see.
well, I mean, this goes back into my analysis episode, but I am pretty sure that the immediate outside world is also controlled by Lumen. The housing seems to be where the Lumen employees work. There's a question as to like whether Rickon might be like a former severed person, etc. So there's some questions about some of the weird behavior of some of his own cult that he has. So maybe there's some legacy in that. I mean, I don't know if that's just some kind of social commentary or if it's actually explicitly the case. Remains to be seen. But then, of course, when you get to like the downtown and you see these people literally protesting, and this punk band is saying like Lumen, screw you, or whatever, there is an active rebellion, and you see it on the news. They put on CNN and people are talking about how Lumen is being sued. So in the broader world, there seems to be much more antagonism towards Lumen than in the immediate vicinity. So to your point, it's almost like if the news broke and it broke within their bubble, they still control it, right, to some extent. And I think that is probably what we're going to see more of in this season as things unfold.
Yeah, it's definitely a company town type of situation.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, for sure. Yeah, I mean, think about how Cobell lives right next door to Mark. I don't think it's a coincidence.
Yeah, that's insane. Yeah.
All right. I really enjoyed the conversation. So hopefully we'll have more fun conversations going forward. I assume this show's only going to become more intriguing as it goes forward. Very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's going to be a lot to keep track of, possibly. But,
Yeah.
as far as apparent motivations and possible motivations and inside people and outside people and the reconciliation of them. But yeah, it should be fun.
And I will be probably doing way more of that over analysis. That so you could just focus on
Well,
enjoying
I'm
the
here
show,
to
and I
bring the
will,
superficial perspective of watching the show in the moment.
which is fine. Most people, that's how most people watch it. So I mean, I'll, but I probably will be doing more of that. So anyway, I will keep you on top of it as we go
And
forward.
thank you so much for doing that heavy lifting because I do not have the capacity, but I do appreciate it very, very much. And I'm sure many people who listen to us appreciate it.
I hope so. So, Sona, we also need to talk about the agency at some point. And so, hopefully, within the next day or so, I will watch
Hmm.
that show, which I have not watched at all because I've been preparing for this Severance
Yeah, we're
conversation.
closing in on the end of that one, right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking probably for the listeners out there, I'm assuming because that is the season finale, the focus will be to get the agency season one finale episode out first. So probably in this same time slot, whenever this episode drops, next week we'll probably be talking about the agency first, and then Severance. This is just episode two of a long season. Will probably be in the back seat, but then of course after that, only Severance going forward until then we have the White Lotus to talk about also. But for the next 4 or 5 weeks or so, we'll be after the wrap up of the agency, we will be talking about Severance. So, and it's going to be there's a lot of overlapping shows here, but hopefully
There
we'll
are. Yeah, we've got to take it one week at a time. This week
exactly
was the much anticipated premiere for Severance.
yeah,
So
exactly. All right, thanks again, and I will talk to you soon.
sounds good. Take care.
All right, you too.
Bye.